Welcome to the RSA webinar on working with policymakers and academics' perspective. My name is Kinga Ostanska, and I'm honored to chair this meeting for you today. A few words about myself. I've been working with policymakers for over 20 years. Currently, I work in the European Parliament in one of the policy departments, supporting 5 committees of the European Parliament with research that is necessary for their work. Our host today is the Regional Studies Association. It's a global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA is supporting its members with latest research, funding schemes, networking, publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. As a response to the current global crisis, the RSA board put in place initiatives to support its members and the wider community, such as this seminar, Professional Development Webinar Series, but also the Region Cities Industry Webinar Series. And if you're interested in more details on these initiatives, they can be found on the RSA website. There is also an RSA app called RSA Hub, which will enable you to network and attend virtual events throughout the year. Before we start, a few housekeeping rules. This webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the RSA Lounge, probably already this afternoon. Please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box and we will come back to them after the webinar. If you want to share information on social media, please use the hashtag RSA webinar to tweet about this event. And now I would like to welcome our great speaker, Heike Meyer. Heike Meyer is a professor of economic geography at the University of Bern in Switzerland. Her research is in local and regional economic development with a focus on dynamics of innovation and entrepreneurship, placemaking, and sustainability. Heike started her academic career in the United States, where she completed a PhD in urban studies at Portland State University. And she held a tenured professorship at Virginia Tech University. She's author of the book Entrepreneurship and Innovation in Second-Tier Regions and co-author of Small Town Sustainability and of The Political Economy of Capital Cities. And Heike, now I would like to pass the floor to you. Please tell us about working with policymakers.
Yeah, Thank you very much, Kinga, for introducing this webinar and for your nice introduction of myself. And thank you, RSA, for the opportunity to share some insights about working with policymakers. I will share my slides with you. Working with policymakers in academics' perspective, I would like to share with you some insights that I personally learned over the last 20 years of working in academia, but always working in academia with an interest and a motivation to make my research relevant and to essentially give an answer to the so what question. Throughout my career, I didn't want to work just on publications that end up in the shelf, behind me, but also make a difference in policy making. And what I would like to share with you are some lessons I learned. And before I do that, I would like to give you a little bit of a background of myself and what I experienced. I'm very interested in outreach and transdisciplinary work through research, but also teaching. So not just my research makes a difference or I aim for difference. Also, I'm trying to have teaching as a relevant tool to influence policymaking. And I'm currently the president of the Swiss Federal Council for Spatial Development. This is a council that advises the government here in Switzerland on issues related to urban planning, regional planning, and we advise, you see a picture here of the council members, we advise ministers in the field of the economy, but also in urban and spatial planning. So in this council, we really have newest insights from research on urban planning, but also from practice. So it's really a committee that sort of combines the practitioner world with the academic world. And over the last 12 years, since I'm in Switzerland, I've worked on a couple of projects that straddled the lines between academia and practice. I've worked on a strategy for rural and mountain regions here in Switzerland. I've just finished a project on theoretical foundations of the new regional policy for Switzerland and other things. And sort of this kind of applied work goes way back into my PhD studies. When I worked at the Institute of Portland Metropolitan Studies at Portland State University, I was engaged in a lot of research projects that were for the region, for the metropolitan region of Portland. And we had a director, Ethan Seltzer, who was really a master of outreach kind of work. So he was a mentor and a guide in how to do it. So all of that experience gave me some insights into how maybe we could do it. And I have 6 lessons that I distilled here. What's important? Well, first of all, it's very important that we make our research relevant to policymakers, because policymakers have different questions. You know, they ask themselves, how can we straddle the political requests with the, let's say, financial constraints that we have when we develop a new innovation policy, for example. Second, we need to invest time as academics in developing the relationships with policymakers. And thirdly, we need to use windows of opportunity. So situations where we can meet policymakers or we can interact with them and then perhaps sort of utilize the opportunities for joint work with policymakers. And then fourth, this is hard work. It's sometimes very disappointing. I will talk later about that. We shouldn't let ourselves be bogged down by the hard, tasks that this kind of work involves. And then fifthly, we need to adapt our communication styles. And 6, I think it's very important to be patient and not to expect too much too quickly. So those 6 lessons, I will go into depth a little bit. I have a slide for each lesson, and I will talk more in detail about them. So what does it mean to make your research really relevant? It means that, research that we conceive that is relevant to policymakers is not research that may be relevant to the field. That is not often the research that fills a gap. It's often more mundane, mundane questions that policymakers are asking, and they are looking for essentially a translation of our insights from academia into their world. So that also means that we need to adapt our presentation and our communication styles to the situations. We may need to have stories ready, anecdotes even, not just hard facts, but in plain language, essentially translate what we mean and how this is relevant to the policymakers. And sometimes we need to be flexible in methods. So we can't be as rigorous, perhaps, when we work with policymakers, because often they are on a different schedule. They have different requirements. They have different audiences than we do. Our audience is the journals in our field, the reviewers, but policymakers, they have the constituencies as audiences, and there's a very different dynamic behind it. And I've often experienced that methods change when I work on projects, become perhaps more pragmatic, a little bit maybe less rigorous, but I think sometimes nonetheless this is not so serious of a problem, because as long as I can translate some new insights from academia into the policy world, I'm fine with that. So that's probably also another lesson that I should add here, is that sometimes it's even good if I provoke policymakers with new ideas and they take it and then adapt it to their field. And it's not so important that I essentially translate one-to-one, certain kind of theories into the field of policymakers making, but it's more important that maybe the ideas are adapted and adopted, essentially. So that's the first lesson. The second lesson is really invest time in the relationships and use different settings, different events. Here there's a picture of me being on a podium in a museum here in Bern, where we talked about economic development of mountain regions. And those situations give the opportunity to meet with policymakers and to exchange ideas, to sort of network with them. And this took quite a long time for me. I'm not a Swiss citizen, or I became one, but I came to Switzerland as a foreigner. And again, this is another hurdle that I had to kind of overcome. And I had to make connections. I had to invest time. I had to gain trust that I was a trustful partner. And it took a lot of networking and energy that I invested in the beginning. I invited policymakers to class. I still do that. They really appreciate that because I think, let's say, professionals really like to come back to universities where they even maybe studied and share their insights. I often work with associations in the field of urban studies, urban planning in Switzerland, sort of setting up workshops or being on conference boards of their sort of applied conferences. And that's also a way to kind of maintain these relationships. So investing time in these relationships, and this can be a challenge because we are all, you know, I recognize we're all under pressure in academia, especially if you're a junior scholar. Publish or perish is often this kind of mantra. I myself invest time in sort of changing academia, that also this kind of work is evaluated in a positive way and has an impact, not just our publications. So I think once you have maybe a department, an institute, a faculty that acknowledges this kind of work, you can make it visible and also have it count in your record. The third lesson is really this windows of opportunity, and they present yourself, and I always say you have to say yes. You know, you have to answer your phone if somebody calls, even if it's a journalist from your newspaper. Answer the phone, give them time, give them your insights, and show that you're ready for dialogue. And here you have a picture of a mayor of a small town near Bern, and he actually was open enough to work with bachelor students on a bachelor topic. They analyzed the residential economy of this town, and he then, even in the end, when they presented, sponsored a little reception for them and really adopted some of these insights of the students. So find opportunities where you can convince policymakers that we in academia can work with them, that we open the door to them, that we say yes to this engagement. And even in teaching situations, whether it's a bachelor thesis, a master thesis, or studios, seminars, you can integrate this kind of interaction. Fourth, this is hard work. It's frustrating sometimes. I listed a lot of adjectives here. It's hard, tedious, exhausting, disappointing. It can be long-winded. It can be very critical. I've had lots of situations where policymakers criticized me and criticized my methods or my insights, and you have to have a little bit of a thick skin if you work with government policy making, because it's a way to, maybe you provoke them with your insights. You question, you call them into question, their work into question. But it can be very rewarding once maybe this trustful relationship develops and your ideas are adopted, have an impact, and share your experiences with others. I mean also with the junior faculty, with your PhD students, with postdocs, because I noticed that they are very interested in this kind of work. And nowadays it's academia. At least here in Switzerland, we have trouble recruiting and retaining academics, junior scholars, and I think it's a way that we can make our work meaningful. Fifth, of course, you need to present and communicate in a very different way. It needs to be appealing visually, but also language-wise. Have always plenty of time to discuss and arrive at common understandings. I think oftentimes we, in this position as a president of the council, I noticed that there are lots of normative assumptions, that everybody has. And hashing them out, working through them, having plenty of time to discuss, that's also a way of arriving at a common understanding. So using a good communication style, visually appealing methods, and time to invest in discussions is really a plus that you can bring to the table. And again, it's a challenge because we rush from teaching to research to whatever. And now on top of that is working with policymakers can be very demanding. 6, be patient. Sometimes things take time. Working with policymakers takes time. Repeat, you have to repeat yourself often. And on top of that, maybe even if you're still interested in publicizing your work in an academic context, you have a report for a policymaker, and then you would like to write a publication about that, that takes time too. It's another translation. So you first translated your theories, ideas, and insights to the policy world, and then you would like to publish about the process or about the whole project. That takes another kind of step. And sometimes we need to train ourselves. And I have 2 exercises, and we don't go through them right now, but once I can share the presentation with you. These exercises may help us to once in a while remind ourselves why we do this kind of work, how we do it. The first exercise is by Peter Elbow. It's free writing, so writing in a free way. Just write down without any organization, not having a stop mark, comma, no edits. Write down what the gist of your message is on a paper. So that way you hone your communication style. And the other thing is storytelling. We don't do that very often. Storytelling helps us to kind of communicate what is the problem that we are researching, why is it relevant, what is the solution, what are the benefits. And the Compass group has a very good exercise here. It's called a message box. So you can also play that through, because here you can really hone your communication style and bring your messages to the point, whether it's working with policymakers or talking to media about your research. This can be a very good exercise that you can use. Yeah, with that, here are a few resources. I find this paper by Phoenix, Atkinson, and Baker very useful. I always love reading Anne Markussen. If you remember Anne Markussen, a very big name in economic geography. She was, for me, the master of working with policymakers and communicating. And she has a paper on communicating political economy, very good. And then there's also a toolbox where you find a lot of different kind of exercises that you can use when you do this kind of transdisciplinary work. And I think coming to the end, just to talk about why it's relevant, and I'm stopping my slides here. Let's see here. Why is it important? I think it's becoming more and more important. If we see what kind of challenges we are facing in our world, in our society, I think we need to work more with policy. We need to also adapt our research. It's not just one way, just from university to society, but also society can teach us a lot. So I think it's an imperative that we have to engage with. And with that, thank you very much. I know Kinga has a lot of questions already, or comments even.
So, I was taking notes. It was very interesting to listen to you, Heike.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this great presentation. In fact, I see that we have questions in the Q&A box, so I will pass to them in a moment. I just wanted to comment on the words that were coming back in your presentation and again, and the words were timing, and the words were trust, and also the easy language and the way how you transfer your message to policymakers. And I must say, from my experience, I see that indeed timing is extremely important in policy making. And this is due to really many reasons, and one of them being that basically we are based on terms, and policymakers never know if they will come back after the elections. So they are really focused on now, here and now, you know, on what they are doing, because they can never promise anything that goes beyond the elections. Also, you cannot forget about the legislative process. If you are too late with your great information to have it included somehow in the current legislative process, it will be useless for the policymakers. So in a way, you really need to be very much au courant with what's going on in the current legislation, because otherwise your information will not be used. But here also this trust issue comes into play, because I've noticed there are plenty of gatekeepers when it comes to contacting policymakers, even for us here working in the parliament, because members of the European Parliament will have their preferred sources of information, policy advisors, you know, or assistants, or specific institutes that they like to contact for information. And that's how, you know, this building slowly the relationship with policymakers is important. And indeed, it can sometimes be wasted if the policymaker will not be re-elected, if they rather not want to take the information from you. But it's a time-consuming process, but nevertheless very important.
Yeah,
yes, go ahead.
Very good points, because there's also, at least from my experience, there's also this level of professionals in government that works on research themselves. So they are researchers in the ministries, in the agencies, and they also prepare policy. They prepare legislation, they prepare statements, they issue research projects, and that level seems to be more stable. You know, they're not disappearing after one cycle, and probably we also need to, well, at least I have a very good relationship to some of them, at least in my areas, and we meet, you know, at professional associations. I invite them to class, and that relationship with those kind of people seems to be very important too, and can help as a gatekeeping.
Exactly.
You call that, yeah.
Yeah. This is exactly what I feel, that sometimes we really want to contact a policymaker, while in fact it would be much easier to get to them through people that they already trust.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly.
And also from my experience, I must say that this information that we provide, it's not only important for it to be written in a simple language, the language that they can understand, that they can pass on to their constituents. They are actually quite often contacted by journalists or by their constituents, and these people ask for information. So for policymakers, it is very important to have information that is kind of reusable, you know, so they can easily not only understand themselves, but easily pass on to others if they are approached in questions about a topic. And here I think there is a great lesson to be learned from lobbyists, actually, that are really very well informed about what's going on. Which brings me to a question that I wanted to ask. How do you actually identify the policymakers that you think will be relevant for your research, you know? So you will not approach all of them, you will pick the ones, right? So how do you do that?
Yeah, so here in Switzerland, there's a peculiar process also in parliament that policymakers can issue petitions or initiatives. And again, there are gatekeepers who usually write those. It's good to kind of have an eye on those petitions and initiatives. Now, this is very specific, I guess, but there's also commissions, you know, in parliament where you could look up who is part of those commissions and meet with them and talk to them. And I heard from a colleague, he's in climate science, and he gave up essentially doing sort of education of policymakers broadly. He does one-on-one now, because he felt that often policymakers don't hear him, you know, and don't hear the facts and the urgency. And he now said that he meets one-on-one, that he identifies those who have, you know, a critical role in certain kind of decisions or commissions, and he meets one-on-one. I've never done that yet. I go through more the gatekeepers, but I think it's a good way to, if there's really an urgent topic like climate adaptation. Now in economic geography with innovation policy, there's not such, I mean, there's an urgency also to sort of do more green path transforming kind of policies. But in our field, it's more through the gatekeepers that I've been working. So identification, it's tricky, yeah, I would say that, but it's not impossible.
No. And in fact, for these meetings, one-to-one meetings, it would be even more important to focus very much on the so what question, because policymakers rarely want to have some general data that you give them. They really want to know what it means in practice, you know, and sometimes even to have some sort of recommendations on, of course, not very specific, because you don't want to seem like you want to do the policy for them. But it is actually quite important to tell them what it means in practice, why they should care about it. So very good. And I will now go to the Q&A box. I see that we have many questions. We might actually run a little bit later, like 5 minutes, maybe more than foreseen. And I don't think we will have time for all of them, but let's see. We have a question about interdisciplinary teaching, especially in urban studies and planning, and how that is aligned with preparing graduates to address policymakers.
Yeah, I think especially urban studies, urban planning, geography, it's such a great field to do this kind of I would say transdisciplinary work. So working not just across disciplines, but also across academic, practitioner kind of world. And I do that. We reformed our curriculum to include a studio. So it's not a seminar, it's also not a lecture, but it's a space in which a small group of students work on problem-oriented questions. And I usually set it up almost like a consulting project where we partner with a group. Maybe it's a regional development agency, or it could be an NGO. And we ask them, what kind of question do you have? What would you like to have answered by the students? And the students work in teams, and they need to develop a problem statement. They need to really engage with the group, with this NGO, with the regional development agency in sort of working through the method and then presenting their results. So I think this kind of problem-oriented teaching, especially with the engagement of outside partners, is a great way to kind of get the students involved, but also to give the students experience so that they can develop their skills of communication, of sort of working with a group, not just working with the small student group, but working with a regional development agency. And so the products can be very diverse. It could be a report. We had even articles for a magazine for this NGO that the students wrote. It could be a nicely designed, even we engaged design students in the design of the report. So it could be an interdisciplinary project. It could be, you know, a project where you go for a week into a region where you work with communities. So, I mean, you can be very creative, and it's also a good way to incorporate innovative ways of teaching and sort of addressing bigger questions about the role of the university in society. Yeah, so that's a very good question.
We have actually many very good questions here, so I will maybe pass to this one. Policymakers often want clear answers. Yes or no, do this or do that. However, as scientists, answer is often it depends, or there are no solutions that work everywhere. It results often in a certain frustration by policymakers. How do you deal with that?
Yeah, I know that. I know that, especially when they want answers about money or numbers or certain kind of effectiveness of policies. That's really a dilemma that we find ourselves in. I'm not sure if I can deal with it very well. This is part what I said about frustration, exhausting, tedious work. I think sometimes I take us, and this comes with experience and with age, maybe, but taking a step back and thinking for myself, what is important for me? So for me, let's say in the Swiss context, the regional development policy, we are not European Union, smart specialization kind of policies. It has been a very traditional export industry oriented policy, and it doesn't work for certain peripheral regions. And so I thought for myself, what is important for me? What do I know from my academic background? What works, what doesn't work? And what point do I want to, what one point do I want to come across? And what would I like to have in the legislation in the next period? And so this was the point of social innovations and of a residential economy, because in the mountain regions, those two levers are very important. So what I decided was I leave out all the noise, noise, I mean, what you just said, it depends, and in this context, it will work like that, it will work. And I decided for myself, I would like to get that into the next legislative, we call it the Botschaft, Standortbotschaft. And I think I honed in on that. I was almost like a politician for that. And it helped that also other colleagues in the past and also currently from other universities here also have that message. And so sometimes that's what I meant by sometimes we have to be pragmatic and maybe thinking about the so what first, then okay, do I have all my proofs? Do I have all my results? Did I have the right methods? Yeah, so I thought about more from the end. Yeah.
Now, we have here a very interesting question. If you see any difference between the approach to work with policymakers and the industry, for example, for-profit organizations, do you see any difference there?
Yeah, I don't work much with industry. I used to in the United States. I had a couple of projects with some industry folks in the high-tech industry. There was a difference in the sense that they're quicker, they are more decided, they're less this, I need to be elected again, they have a clear focus, and it was a bit easier to get stuff done. But other than that, I don't know what the big differences are, sorry.
Maybe the last question before we need to wrap up. How much theory do you think should be included in a policy report? For example, if you write a policy report about watch industry in Swiss, how much agglomeration theory will you include in the policy report and why?
Yeah, again, the work needs to be informed about theory. It needs to be informed about latest developments and thinking about, let's say, agglomeration theory or the absence of agglomeration when you talk about the watch industry. But I think it doesn't need to be so long. It doesn't need to be so many references like we use in publications. It needs to be more in a language that is understandable, that doesn't make the reader feel dumb, because that's also an issue that we shouldn't be arrogant, with our knowledge. We also should be humble and sort of help people understand theory. So I think theory is important because this is our foundation, and based on our foundation we can make informed policy. Then I think it needs to be in there, but not too much.
Heike, thank you very much. We have many more questions, which shows that this session was really needed, and maybe we can organize another one in the future. Thank you, Heike, for this presentation. Thank you, RSA, for hosting this meeting, and to all attendees. Thank you very much for your interest, for great questions that you asked in the Q&A box. And I would like to invite you to the next webinar that will be organized on the 1st of March. And it will be by Betsy Donald on support for researchers, building stronger research grants and projects. You can also check further sessions and webinars in this series on the RSA website. This website also includes more information on the membership, and it will work both for maybe your career and I invite you to check the RSA page. Thank you once again, and I wish you all a great afternoon.